lovely if you could move in. Thank you. Perfect. Oh, I appreciate it. And if you have your Fitbit on, you just got some more steps. So, yeah, I've become a little addicted to mine. Well, I'm Georgina Dodge, and I'm an Associate Vice President here at the university, and I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer and Title IX Coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome you here at this event. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the co-sponsors along with the Chief Diversity Office. Sarah Hansen with the Division of Student Life is one of our co-sponsors, and Linda Snetzlar with the theme semester in the Office of Outreach and Engagement. Thank you both. Thanks to your units for making this event possible. And I now have the great honor of introducing Eboo Patel, who is a leading voice in the movement for interfaith cooperation and the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, IFYC, a national nonprofit working to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. He is the author of Acts of Faith, Sacred Ground, and the forthcoming Interfaith Leadership. Named by U.S. News and World Report as one of America's best leaders of 2009, Eboo served on President Obama's Inaugural Faith Council. He is a regular contributor to the public conversation around religion in America and a frequent speaker on the topic of religious pluralism. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes scholarship. For over 15 years, Eboo has worked with governments, social sector organizations, and college and university campuses to help realize a future where religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. Please join me in welcoming to the University of Iowa, Eboo Patel.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Dr. Dodge. Thank you, Aspen and Becca. I have to laugh every time I hear a Fitbit reference because it reminds me of my 8-year-old and his teacher at school. So she and her husband have a contest to see how many steps they can get at the end of the day, and it gets computerized in the Fitbit. Well, the way she wins every day is she gives my 8-year-old her Fitbit during recess, and he runs around and does 8-year-old things, collects 2,500 steps, and she goes home and gets whatever prize she gets from her husband for winning every night. So if you see Mrs. Clifford and Mr. Clifford, you got a little secret to tell Mr. Clifford about why he's losing the Fitbit race every night. So you can game any kind of technology, right? I'm thrilled to be here. I actually want to open with a line by Marcel Proust. It's a great line that makes me think about what the college experience is all about. He says, "The true journey of discovery is not in seeing new landscapes, it's in developing new eyes." And a moment in which I developed a new eyes around religious diversity happened for me in Cape Town, South Africa in December of 1999. I was there with some friends to commemorate the turning of the millennium at a conference called the Parliament of the World's Religions, and I saw Mandela speak. And he comes to the podium looking even more regal in person, even though I was like in the nosebleeds, right? You could just tell that a giant had arrived. And he came and he just filled the space with his presence, and somebody in the back stood up and started to do a chant, a Xhosa chant for the arrival of the chief, and Mandela just kind of cocked his head and let it wash over him. And then he pointed out into the Cape, and he let his finger stay there for a moment or two, and he said, "I would still be there." And there was Robben Island, where he'd spent 10,000 days of his life imprisoned. He said, "I would still be there if it wasn't for the Christians and the Muslims, the Hindus and the Jews, the Baha'is and the African traditionalists and the secular humanists of South Africa coming together in the struggle against apartheid." And it was a striking moment for me because I was in South Africa because I'd been so inspired by stories of the struggle. I mean, this was the last legally racist country to fall. It was in some ways the end of a remarkable, ugly era, the ushering in of something new. But I had missed this part of history that Mandela opened with. I'd missed the dimensions of religious diversity involved in the struggle. And I thought to myself, for all I'd read about this, for the depth of my care and concern and my knowledge, I had literally no idea that there was this significant group of Jews involved in this movement, that there was something called the Muslim Youth Movement, Farid Essaq, who married me 5 years later. Ibrahim Rasool, Ibrahim Musa, Rashid Omar. Desmond Tutu wasn't just a great leader, he was a great archbishop. It was the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. There was this massive religious dimension involved in this movement that I had such great admiration for. For me, it was new eyes. And I started to think about all the work that I had done during my university years, the time when I had first cut my teeth on diversity and social justice issues. My friend Mark Santillian is in the audience. We went to Glenbard South High School in the western suburbs of Chicago. There is no more pre-professional high school in the Midwest than that joint. It turns out engineers and accountants and good folks like that, right? And I hadn't really thought that much about racism, hadn't really thought that much about social justice, marginalization, oppression issues. I get to college and I just get swept up in early, mid-90s era social justice work. I mean, you can't walk 10 feet at that time without running into somebody reading Race Matters by Cornel West or Pedagogy of the Oppressed or something by Bell Hooks, right? This was the time right after the Rodney King trial. This was the time when Murray and Herrnstein, right, the bell curve. This is the time when Harvard starts their African American Studies department. It's in the air we're breathing, it's in the water we're swimming in. And I'm thinking to myself, man, this is like liberation, right? Like I'd always grown up a brown kid in a white world wanting to scratch my brown skin white, and I felt like I couldn't talk about it with anybody. I had no language for that. But here in college, it was a stage and a microphone and an opportunity to tell a story, to listen to other stories, to really dig deep into this. I love the fact that in freshman orientation, we start not with where the buildings are at the University of Illinois, but on diversity issues. I really love that in RA training, we spend 2 weeks going through this training, and half of it is given over to diversity issues. But in 1999, in Cape Town, South Africa, when a new diversity issue is presented in front of me in a manner that is nothing short of awe-inspiring, perhaps the greatest figure of the 20th century saying he would still be in jail if it wasn't for this interfaith movement, I thought to myself, I'd missed something in my college education on diversity and social justice. I'd missed this massive contribution by people who orient around religion differently, working together for the common good. I started to bring those eyes into other parts of my life, started to ask the question, just like I learned to ask in college, what are the race dimensions of this? What are the gender dimensions? What are the sexuality dimensions? I started to ask myself, what are the religious dimensions of this? What are the interfaith dimensions? What play do faith identities have in this situation? Something, as I said, I'd been blind to for a long time. So, for me, an interesting example is the film Selma. Anybody seen that film? I mean, one of the great films of the past couple years, right? And largely because of the eyes that I developed to that moment in South Africa, I start to pick up interfaith grace notes in that film. Right? It wasn't just Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leading a march. It was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. leading a march and a movement. And when it was midnight and he was despondent, who did he call? Mahalia Jackson. And what did he ask for? Mahalia, will you sing me a gospel song? And at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, with thousands of marchers behind him and hundreds of police officers with truncheons in front of him, and he didn't know what to do, what move did he make? He knelt and he prayed. Selma wasn't just a story of African American Christianity from the Deep South in evidence. It was a story of a lot of people from different religious identities there. James Reeb, the great Unitarian Universalist pastor from Boston, was in Selma. He has this line of, When Dr. King calls, you have to answer. He lost his life there, one of the people martyred in Selma. Dan Berrigan, the great Jesuit priest, was in Selma. He gives a sermon where he says, "Where is the church? Is it the bricks and mortar from where we came? Or is it here in the streets of Selma?" And a nun in full habit walking down Highway 80 in Selma says, as if in answer to Berrigan's question, "We are the church." Abraham Joshua Heschel is in Selma, a man who'd watched 6 million of his co-religionists burn in Hitler's hellfires in Europe, who escaped the trains going from Warsaw to Auschwitz by 6 weeks, entire family lost, almost the entire line of Hasidic Judaism. He survives, comes to the Upper West Side of New York, teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary. If there's one person who has a right to focus only on his own people, it is Abraham Joshua Heschel in mid-20th century America. Instead, there's something about the civil rights movement, about King's prophetic voice that captures Heschel, and he comes to Selma. One of the iconic pictures of the civil rights movement is this older Jewish man with this long, bushy beard marching arm in arm with King. Well, that's Heschel in Selma. And later he says, "I know that the way Martin Luther King Jr. and I worship is different, but in Selma, when we were marching, I felt like my legs were at prayer." We are not far away from the day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s martyrdom, the anniversary, April 4th. You know where he was heading that day? He's heading to Heschel's home to celebrate the Passover Seder, probably his closest non-Christian friend in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X is in Selma, a post-Hajj Malcolm X, coming with something of a different message than the younger Malcolm X, a man who has gotten a glimpse into the diversity of the Muslim world, Arab and Indian, African and white. He comes and he has a conversation with Coretta Scott King, and he says that he wants to talk about reconciliation. He actually climbs up into the pulpit of a church, unimaginable for Malcolm, literally a year before, and he preaches this message that feels a lot like King's beloved community. It's a film, Selma. It's interfaith eyes on that film. And I think to myself, if I hadn't had those eyes, if I hadn't had that moment in Darshan and witness with Mandela, if I hadn't asked myself the question, what are the interfaith dynamics of this range of situations, I would never have caught those interfaith grace notes in Selma. What do we miss when we don't ask ourselves the question, in what ways do diverse orientations around religion impact this situation? Well, Madeleine Albright wrote a book about this in the early 2000s. I shared it with a couple of the students who are here earlier. So when most former senior officials write books, they're basically hero stories of everything that they did right and who's to blame for the things that they got wrong. Albright writes a very different book in the early 2000s. She writes a book about the big area of diplomacy that she got wrong, the stuff about the Almighty. She goes back into the 1990s when she's the Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, and she talks through a variety of the major conflicts: Northern Ireland, South Asia, India and Pakistan almost come to nuclear war in the late 1990s. The Middle East, of course, the Balkans, the bombings in East Africa. And she notes that at the heart of every one of these conflicts are intertwined religious identities. Orthodox Christian, Muslim in the Balkans, Catholic, Protestant in Belfast, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian in the Middle East, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist in South Asia. And she says, we basically missed all of this. We were part of a liberal school of diplomacy that focused on matters of economics and governance. We absolutely marginalized issues of cultural and religious identity. If you had asked me, Albright said, what role religion would play in the post-Cold War world order, I'd have laughed at you and said you had gone off to join the Flat Earth Society. But having a little distance from her service, looking back, she thinks to herself, we might have been so much closer to a deal in the Middle East. We might have been able to foresee the near nuclear conflagration in the Indian subcontinent if I had even half as many religious advisors in the State Department as I had economic advisors. She talks about the legions of people who knew about economics and constitutions in her State Department, and the exactly one person who was an expert on religion. What do we miss when we lack the eyes to see the dimensions of religious diversity in the situations all around us? I want to take a step back for a second, and I want to suggest that no small part of the 21st century will be about how we build religiously diverse democracies. How do we build religiously diverse democracies? And what I really mean is, how do we build healthy religiously diverse democracies? I want to actually, because I'm a geek, define each of those words, if you'll allow me. Democracy is not just a place where people are allowed to vote for their representatives. Democracy is a place where people get to make their personal convictions public. If you are pro-choice, you can stand out on the street corner and hand out flyers for the view that you have. You can shout your views from a soapbox on the quad. You can start a nonprofit organization based on your views. You can give money to a candidate who shares your views. You can run for office yourself, and you can do the exact same thing if you're pro-life. Democracy is a remarkable thing, right? It is a place where people who have deep personal convictions don't have to keep those convictions private, can make them very, very public. Diversity. Now, there is no more beloved word on a college campus than diversity. Right? In elementary school, we learned that multiculturalism is a strength, that diversity ought to be celebrated. It is a model of diversity that I like to call samosas and egg rolls. Right? Bring it all tastes good. In college, you start to learn that this is actually a little bit more complicated. That diversity is not just about the differences you like, it's about the differences you don't like. It's about the disagreements. What do you do when you live in a diverse democracy? What do you do when the person next to you has personal convictions very different, even in opposition to the ones you have? What do you do when the person next to you has every right and privilege to make those personal convictions public, as you do? How do you have a diverse democracy? Now let's throw an even more challenging matter into the mix. How do you have a religiously diverse democracy? What makes religion distinctive? Well, Paul Tillich, the great theologian, once said that what religion really is ultimate concerns. It's the things that people will and have and will continue to kill and die for. Ultimate concerns. Why were we created? How? By who? What is a moral human life? What's human purpose at all? What happens after we die? What is right belief? What happens to people who don't have right belief? Religion. Okay, religiously diverse democracy. A place where people who disagree on matters of ultimate concerns can make those personal convictions public. Is it any wonder that half of the New York Times on any given day is stories of wars between people who orient around religion differently? These are, after all, not egg roll and samosas type issues. These are issues of, will I have to dress the way your religious belief system requires me to dress? Will I have to eat the way your religious belief system requires me to eat? Will I have to gender segregate that way? In India, a Hindu nationalist party recently got elected. in accordance with their Hindu belief, they removed all meat from the public school system. That means that if you are Muslim in India and it is part of your practice to eat meat, your child is no longer doing that in the public school. That means that if you are poor, and many hundreds of millions of people in India are, and meat from especially eggs, protein from eggs is the largest source of protein in your diet, and your kid relies on that for nutrition, literally survival, it's no longer available because the religious convictions of the governing party have removed any meat product, including eggs, from the public school lunch service. How do you build a religiously diverse democracy? As somebody who hails from India, we, even in the diaspora, like to proudly say that India is the most populous democracy in the world. Well, is this democracy? Interesting, right? A large group of people voted into office a government that made their personal convictions public by removing meat products from the school lunch system. We have parallel conversations in this country about things like abortion. Again, is it any wonder that it is a significant challenge to build a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? So what does healthy mean in this context? I tend to shy away from the view that says healthy means that one day you will agree with me. I actually don't believe that Catholics will stop viewing the Pope as the vicar of Christ on earth. I don't believe that evangelicals will stop viewing Jesus as the Son of God and the one true Lord and Savior. I do not believe that Baha'is will agree with me that Muhammad is the final prophet. I do not believe that Jains will come around to my view that eating lamb and goat on the Muslim holiday of Eid is actually a religious celebration. In other words, I live with the fact that there are people with very sharp differences from me, deep disagreements. What does it mean in that situation when they can make their personal convictions public to have a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? Here's my definition of it. People have to be able to disagree on some fundamental things and work together on other fundamental things. I'm going to repeat that. In a healthy, religiously diverse democracy, where deep disagreement on ultimate concerns is baked into the DNA of the system, the only way to have healthiness is for people to be able to disagree on some fundamental things and work together on other fundamental things. Because I spend a good part of my life on college campuses, I'm on about a campus a week these days. Part of what I hear is students with very strong views on things ranging from abortion to Middle East politics to same-sex marriage to definitions of oppression. And part of what they say about groups with whom they disagree is, we have chosen to boycott the Hillel. We will not talk to them because they disagree on where to draw the line in Jerusalem. We won't talk to the Muslim Students Association because they brought a BDS speaker to campus. We refuse to talk to InterVarsity Christian Fellowship because their definition of a relationship doesn't include me. All of this makes good sense to me. I have strong views too. They tend to be on the progressive side. And I understand what it looks like to say, if you are going to hurt me in that way, to disagree with me in that way, I have nothing to do with you. I'd start to think for a second. What if I was a heart surgeon? What if you were a heart surgeon? What if you and I disagreed on where to draw the line in the Middle East, and I had walked out of a civic meeting with you in protest of your views? What if we were scheduled for heart surgery next Tuesday? What if the patient was in a dire situation, life and death? What happens if when I arrive at the operating room, I see you putting on your gloves, opening up the equipment, preparing to operate? What if I realize that my partner in heart surgery today is somebody who disagrees with me in Middle East politics? Do I refuse? Do I walk away? Do I decide that because we disagree on the fundamental matter of where to draw the line in the Middle East, I will not work with you on the fundamental matter of performing a life-saving heart surgery? I wouldn't make that decision. So then I start to ratchet it down. If you are a parent of Mrs. Clifford's second grade class, and I'm a parent of Mrs. Clifford's second grade class, you have a daughter in the classroom, and I have a son, will I refuse to be part of a fundraising effort with you to enrich the arts program in that class because we disagree on abortion? I guess I wouldn't do that. Would I refuse to sit on the PTA with you? If I saw you at the neighborhood picnic, would I get up and turn around and walk out? I guess I wouldn't want to be that person either. So how do I stand up for my conviction on Middle East politics when you disagree with me? And I guess the only way that I can think about thinking through this is reflecting on some things we're going to disagree, on some fundamental things. But if that cancels out the opportunity to have a relationship, if that cancels out the ability to do other fundamental things together, how do you have a religiously diverse democracy? Unless you happen to be of the opinion that one day everybody's going to come around to your view. And I promise you, Hillary voters think that, and Bernie voters think that. Ted Cruz folks think that, and Donald Trump people think that, right? Evangelicals have thought that for 2,000 years, and Muslims have thought that for 1,400 years. How do you live in a religiously diverse democracy once you get rid of the fiction that not everybody's going to come around to your view? You learn that you're going to disagree on some fundamental things and learn to work together on other fundamental things. What does it look like to flex that muscle, to practice that in college? To say that with the pro-life group or the pro-choice group, with the BDS group or the Students for Israel group, with the college Republicans or the college Democrats, with the Secular Student Alliance and the Muslim Students Association, you're going to disagree on some fundamental things and learn how to work together on other fundamental things. Listen, simply put, diverse identities in a democracy can turn into one of four things: bubbles of isolation, barriers of division, bludgeons of domination, or bridges of cooperation. And here's the thing. Bridges don't fall from the sky or rise from the ground. People build them. And the people who build bridges that bring people who orient around religious diversity together and lead them to a place that we at IFYC call pluralism, we call interfaith leaders. They're folks with the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill set to build those bridges. I think of interfaith leader as an identity category. Same kind of identity category as human rights activist, social entrepreneur, environmentalist. I was recently at University of the Pacific. It's this little college in Stockton, California. And they house the John Muir archives. Anybody here heard of John Muir? It's a guy from Wisconsin, good Midwesterner, who finds his way out west. And he stands in the middle of San Francisco and he grabs somebody and says, "Show me somewhere wild." And the person points him to Yosemite. And he's so blown away by Yosemite that he thinks to himself, we have to conserve these wild places. This is in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he gives the people who care about that a name: conservationist. And he starts the Sierra Club. He starts working with Teddy Roosevelt on the national park system. And all these people who for a long time cared about the wild places in America, thought that they deserved protection because they were so precious, they had a name to call themselves: conservationist. 50, 60 years later, a woman named Rachel Carson comes along, writes a book called Silent Spring, shifts the discourse a little bit, shows just how permeating pollution has become. And people who once called themselves conservationists are calling themselves environmentalists. Think about it for a second. Think about if you didn't have a name to call yourself. If you thought that the environment was precious and ought to be protected. Think about if you didn't have a name to call yourself, if you thought that every human being is born in dignity, and governments, at the very least, shouldn't violate that dignity and actually ought to have a legal obligation to protect it. Think about if you didn't have the name human rights activist to call yourself. You wouldn't have a literature to easily go to. You wouldn't have a group of people to identify with. You wouldn't have the ability to improve in your craft, in your knowledge, in your skills, in your qualities. I think the same thing is true of building bridges between people who orient around religion differently. There's a vision associated with that. It's the vision that Mandela talked about. It's the vision in that film Selma. There's other visions. There's Sam Huntington's vision of a clash of civilizations, right? To be an interfaith leader, you need a vision of a society in which people who orient around religion differently are respecting each other's identities, are building relationships between different communities, and are cultivating some vision of the common good. You need a knowledge base, something of the history of interfaith cooperation, of the role it plays in the struggle, in Selma, in Hind Swaraj. You need to know probably something of your own theology of interfaith cooperation. What is it from your humanist ethic, or your Baha'i, or your Jain, or your Sikh belief system that commands you to engage in bridge building work? You need an appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions. In other words, you cannot only get your information about Islam from the evening news. Know that the man who designed the skyscrapers of Chicago, Fazlur Rahman Khan, was a Muslim. Remember that America's greatest 20th century sports icon, Muhammad Ali, is a Muslim. That no small number of our great artists, rappers, Mos Def, etc., Muslim. Right? You need to know the things that you admire about a tradition, the things that you find beautiful, the things that move you, even if you don't share the doctrine of that tradition, this appreciative knowledge, this history, this theology. There's a knowledge base to interfaith leadership. If you don't have a name to call yourself, it's hard to grow in that knowledge base. It's hard to grow in the skill set, the ability to offer a public narrative about the importance of this work, the ability to create events that bring people who orient around religion differently together, to facilitate that dialogue, to mobilize folks. These are skills that, yes, are useful in a variety of areas, but if you're going to be going to folks in secular humanist societies and mosques and synagogues and temples and gurdwaras, churches, you better have a particular language, a particular way of bringing those folks into a common space, and you better know what to talk about with them when they're there. This vision, this knowledge base, this skill set, it's not that different than being an environmentalist or a social entrepreneur or a human rights activist. It's a highly relevant, useful 21st century identity category. So what's the role of the academy in nurturing this? Right? So Christy and perhaps a few others in this room are part of this nascent subfield that's beginning to call itself interfaith studies. Part of what the academy does is it looks into the society at large and asks the question, what are some interesting and important phenomena that are happening, that are worthy of our inquiry, of our research, of our intervention? Some decades back, a group of people decided that this thing called public health was a new animal in the academy, that the traditional way of educating people into medicine was not sufficient, that the way diseases worked in certain populations required particular forms of inquiry and research, particular models of intervention, that the one-on-one relationship that typifies doctor-patient interaction wasn't equipped to handle. A new field emerges called public health. The question that I would put before you today is the question around, or are the questions around creating healthy, religiously diverse democracies, are they rigorous enough? Are they large and robust enough to require a new subfield? Scholars from different disciplines coming together to study the phenomena of how people who orient around religion differently, will interact with each other. Historians would ask the question, in what types of civilizations did people who oriented around religion differently tend to get along better, and why? Why was 10th, 11th century Cairo and Cordoba Muslim empires and civilizations? Why were they relatively inclusive, welcoming, tolerant places at a time when the West was far from that? What happens in Western civilization to allow it many centuries later to be relatively inclusive and welcoming when Muslim civilization takes a different kind of turn? Political scientists might ask the question, what governing arrangements best facilitate religious inclusivity? Does it require something like a First Amendment, a statement of the freedom of religion? Does it require a disestablishment, no state church? It's interesting to ask that when one considers that European countries, England for example, there are state churches. The Queen is the head of the Anglican Church in England, and when she goes to Scotland, I kid you not on this, she's a Presbyterian, because the state church of Scotland within Britain is a Presbyterian church. So she literally changes churches when she crosses the border. Do you need a separation of church and state in order to have religious inclusivity? The kind of question a political scientist would study. Social psychologists would have a lot to say about this. What happens when people from different religions come to the same summer camp? Muzaffar Sharif ran a study like this about a half century ago called the Robbers Cave Experiment. Is it going to be the case that the Muslims and the Christian are going to create their own tribal type units and start to pit themselves against one another? What kinds of activities would create cooperation? Interestingly, we haven't yet gotten to religious studies or theology, although clearly people who study texts and doctrine would have a lot to say about this as well. Is there enough there? Is there enough happening in the world when it comes to people who orient around religion differently interacting to justify a new subfield, a center, a unit, like a Department of Educational Studies or urban policy or public health, that brings people from different scholarly backgrounds together to focus on one object, in this case, religious diversity and its interactions, to develop as good an understanding of it as possible, and to design intervention programs to improve the situation. A few weeks back, I was at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. White working class town on the shores of Lake Erie, you think to yourself, right? Rust Belt type place. Yes, and a little town that has resettled in the course of the past 25 years significant numbers of Syrian, Bhutanese, Sudanese, Iraqi, and Bosnian refugees. I want you to think about this for a second, right? A town that's probably not massively bigger than Iowa City in population, that has resettled tens of thousands of refugees from across the world, many of them fleeing religious conflicts, just about all of them bringing religious identities and expressions hitherto unknown to the local population of Erie, Pennsylvania. A third of the public high schools in Erie, Pennsylvania are now refugee kids who are Bhutanese, Sudanese, Syrian, and Iraqi. If you're a teacher in that high school, you think you only need to know how to teach algebra to be effective with those kids? To know nothing about where they come from, how they interact with each other, what Ramadan is, why 15 of your students leave at noon on Friday It's not because they're skipping class. It's because there's this thing called Juma prayers that many Muslims think is obligatory. Why the South Sudanese students stay as far away from the Syrians as possible? Because they're escaping a civil war in Sudan that was characterized by Muslim-Christian conflict. Their experience with Muslims is not pretty. You think you only need to know how to teach basketball to be a PE teacher in the Erie public school system? What would it look like if a team from the University of Iowa, led by Christy, a team of sociologists, religious studies scholars, theologians, urban policy experts, political scientists, social psychologists, spent 6 months studying the real-world laboratory of Erie, Pennsylvania, asking the question, what are the dynamics of this newly religiously diverse city? How do the different religious groups engage or not engage with the police department, with the criminal justice system, with the health system? There might not have been very many Muslims in Erie, Pennsylvania before 25 years ago, but Muslims have a very particular way of being buried. Do the hospitals in Erie know to work with funeral services that do Muslim burials? Hindus also have a very particular way of entering into the afterlife. Cremation. Zoroastrians definitely do. Yazidis, a new group being resettled across America. If you're a nurse or a doctor in the Erie hospital system, it's not just about finding the vein. It's about knowing how a Bhutanese mother understands the creation story of her baby when her baby girl is born. Right? It is that whole realm of culture and mythology that comes with it. What does it look like to study that situation for 6 months? To offer a set of recommendations to the chief of police, to the superintendent of schools, to the CEOs of hospitals, to the city council as it fields several applications for new houses of worship, to the public health department that hasn't heard of half of the foods that new restaurants in Erie, Pennsylvania are now serving, and say, we're going to help the institutions of Erie adapt to this new religiously diverse environment. I'm going to end with this final story of how I kind of got this image of a team of people who would come into a place like Erie, dramatically new situation of religious diversity in that city, and help the institutions engage that diversity towards a vision of positive pluralism. It's not dissimilar from a team of public health experts entering in and saying, there's an obesity challenge in this town, and we're going to look at what's served in school lunches, we're going to look at poverty rates, we're going to look at exercise issues, we're going to look at poverty issues, we're going to look at family setup issues, we're going to do this study, and then we're going to recommend a set of interventions across various institutions that we think will impact the poverty rate. And then you come back in 2 years and you measure your progress. Here's my final story, and here's where I kind of get this window into this possibility. Last summer, I was invited to the Greater Chicagoland Food Depository. On the one hand, it's massively inspiring. Football field-sized warehouse, food everywhere, canned goods, fresh vegetables and fruit, several trucks idling ready to carry this food everywhere. On the other hand, it's something of a scandal. I mean, we're a rich country, and there's people who go hungry here. Right? So I'm like sitting there in this consternation thinking through this, and the president of the food depository says, I invited you here today because I think you might be able to help us with something we're trying to get our head around. She showed me the list of all the distribution centers in the Chicagoland area that this warehouse served, the 650 places where people from all over Chicago actually come to get their food. And she said over 400 are associated with houses of worship and faith-based organizations. Interesting, think about that. If you never think about religion, you miss the massive contribution that these religious communities make to this very real thing called addressing hunger. She showed me the volunteer list, the people who come and pack the food into the trucks. Easily 2/3 of the volunteer groups. at the Greater Chicago Food Depository on a weekly basis are associated with faith-based organizations and houses of worship. And she looked at me and she said, 30 years ago, this would all say church. But notice, many now say synagogue, mosque. You've got temples here. You've got some secular humanist societies. You've got some Buddhist groups. As Chicago has grown increasingly religiously diverse, our food distribution sites have grown religiously diverse. Our volunteer groups have grown religiously diverse. Now here's an interesting thing. The Muslims come in here, they read a little bit from the Quran, they do their 2 hours of volunteering, they say a prayer, sometimes it's salat time, they do their salah, and they leave. The Christians come in here, they read something of the Bible, they do their 2 hours of volunteering, they maybe sing a hymn at the end or have a moment of reflection or silence or another Bible reading, and they leave. The Jews come in here and they do the same thing. But they all come in here separately. Sometimes they smile at each other as they pass one another as they get into their vans. But the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians and the secular humanists, the Baha'is, they got the same pattern, but they're not working together. And every once in a while, we'll encourage people to do that, and nobody ever says no, but frankly, nobody really signs up either. So we looked you up. Interfaith Youth Corps, right? We see a time in which not only are the Buddhists and the Baha'is volunteering together, but they're going down to Springfield, the state capital, to lobby together, to advocate together. Our most effective public service campaigns are ones that appeal to people's identity and religion and values. And we keep on thinking to ourselves, boy, we'd love to not just have a pastor on one commercial and an imam on another. We'd love to have a public service campaign where there's a rabbi, an imam, and a pastor, and a secular humanist leader speaking together. We think that that would show a kind of cooperative spirit. We suggest it, and people say, I'll call you, and they never call. I think to myself, you know what you need? An interfaith leader. You think these skills emerge out of thin air? You think that just anybody can go to different houses of worship and recruit them to come to an interfaith volunteer activity? That just anybody can facilitate that conversation? That when the question of where to draw the line in the Middle East comes up, that just anybody has the ability to say, you know what, that's an important conversation, but we're focusing on a different fundamental thing right now. That when the Salafi group walks in and the Sufis who are in the space start to get a little bit nervous, that just anybody's going to pick up on that internal diversity within Islam. That when the Knights of Columbus walk in and the people who just went to see Pope Francis start to think, oh gosh, is this going to be a theological argument? That just anybody's going to pick up on that slight vibration. If you have people who are trained in social work, that work with certain populations here because they're trained to do so, why wouldn't you have somebody trained in interfaith studies? Why wouldn't you have somebody who has acquired the skill set, the knowledge base, and the vision of interfaith leadership through coursework and co-curricular activities, right? And people start to say to me, well, I wonder who would do such a thing. And I think to myself, you know, we live in this remarkable society that has put aside space and resources for these really smart 19-year-olds to come together and to interact with some of the best minds in our society who have this magic thing called tenure, in which they can pursue research interests over long periods of time and basically not pay attention to people telling them what to do. They can follow their ideas of what matters. We have a place in our society that attempts to organize these things, right? The university is this magic space that 100 years ago didn't have environmental studies programs. That emerges because enough people think that the way we treat our environment is important enough in the world that we ought to study it, teach it, and train for it in the academy. Is the way that people who orient around religion differently interact, is that important enough in the world that we would begin to organize around that? That we would bring together teams of scholars to study it, that enough students would look to take courses in it, that we would be nurturing a critical mass of interfaith leaders to take up that position at the Chicago Food Depository, to be that intervention team in Erie, Pennsylvania, to start to help build out of America's religiously diverse democracy something of a city on the hill, a place that we're proud of, a place that other people can look to, a place that lives up to its idea and ethic and vision, to end with that image of Mandela, right? A rainbow nation, a place where people from different backgrounds, different belief systems, who disagree on fundamental things, are able to work together to build something in spite of their differences, something beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for just a few questions if folks want to stand up where you are and project, or there's a microphone right here if you want to ask some questions.
I can probably hear you if you just want to project from there. Or you can take the microphone.
Well, you convinced me that it's really a good idea to have a discipline of interfaith studies as a subject for research. How do you convince the average taxpayer to support such a development?
Yeah.
Or is that in itself a research issue?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not sure we have to, at this point, convince the average taxpayer, right? I don't view this as a huge outlay of resources. I mean, I think what's really interesting is that there's enough faculty members in the country right now that they're kind of entrepreneuring some of this on their own. They're basically using existing resources and shifting it. So we were just at a conference at California Lutheran University last week, and there's 120 faculty members who are starting to see themselves in this emerging subfield of interfaith studies. 15 of them have started minors at their universities. I called out my friend Christy here, who's in conversation about this here, also a full professor in the Department of Religious Studies here. So this is emerging, and it's an exciting time to watch that happen. Right, so I think at this point what we're talking about are shifts in resource lines, and I mean the wonderful thing about humanities-oriented things is they're not actually that expensive. There's a lot of words involved, but there's not a lot of buildings or laboratories involved. So it's not a huge expense right now. I think it's a question of is this area as the facts on the ground in this area grow, will people go to those facts on the ground? Will they populate the classes? Will they take their certificate programs? Will they sign up for the minors, et cetera? And we'll see if that's the case. Yes?
It seems to me that often, even when there's difference, there's always a ghettoization throughout history, throughout many cultures. Do you need to say we have to overcome that ghettoization, or do we just have to accept that and find ways to cross-pollinate something?
Yeah. So I think there's a great line by the political philosopher Michael Walzer that the challenge of a diverse society is to embrace its differences and maintain a common life. And part of what he means by embracing those differences is that distinct identity communities, whether it's black folks, Chinese folks, Mexican folks, Indian folks, that there's something of that ethnicity that organizes itself into a community with distinct patterns, language patterns, culinary patterns, marriage patterns, child raising patterns, etc. So how do you allow for the creation of identity communities while also encouraging cross-pollination? So, the sociologist Robert Putnam talks about it as bonded social capital, which is the identity community, which you're referring to as ghettoization, and bridged social capital, which is the relationships between different identity communities. My own sense is a society needs both. So, wife and I are Muslim, and we send our kids to a public school during the day and a Muslim religious education school on Friday afternoons. It's important to us to be a part of continuing the identity community that is Islam, its distinctive belief system, prayer practices, solidarities, etc. And it's important for our kids, for our kids to be involved in a public school with kids from a range of different backgrounds. So the question is, how do you have both? How do you not embrace differences to the point where you override a common life? That's dangerous. That's tribalism, right? That's a recipe for civil war. And how do you not make the common life, a favorite higher ed word, hegemonic? You like that? I use that? Where's Aspen? You like that? You like that? Thank you. How do you not make the common life hegemonic so that it overrides difference? Look, I actually think this is a very hard balance to achieve, and if you, in various parts of the world, where there is significant internal conflict, my guess is it's because they got the balance wrong, right? So, the last thing I'll say on this is, in very interesting question, in the territory on the map marked Iraq, is there really in Iraq? Which is to say, do the people who live within that geography in the territory on the map marked Iraq, do they identify with a thing larger than a Sunni, a Shia, or a Kurdish identity that could be called the national identity of Iraq, right? And in the absence of that, what you have is effectively a civil war between different religious communities occupying a particular territory, all seeking supremacy in that territory. Yes.
You addressed so nicely the idea of the interfaith certificate, officializing the subject study, which seems to be maybe on the responsibility of faculty. But I'm wondering how you would address the students in the kind of work that they can do to create that kind of environment if that's possible.
So I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I'm going to answer it, and you tell me if I'm getting your question right. So one of the ways that we love presenting things at Interfaith Youth Corps is through case studies, right? So we would literally, we spent the last 10 hours basically presenting a variety of case studies. We've had so much fun with you folks doing that here. So what happens if your common book read at a university lifts up dimensions of sexuality identity, but winds up being offensive to dimensions of religious identity? How do you deal with those people who feel offended? It's a very interesting question, right? Because it asks the question, how should the committee who assigns a freshman book read view identity issues? What do you do if you are a doctor in a hospital and a Hmong family brings their little girl to the hospital and she's shaking uncontrollably, and you're the doctor and you say, this is called a seizure and your daughter might be epileptic, and the Hmong family looks at you and says, this is called preparation for shamanhood, right? So that's in a book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. What if you do if you're a doctor in that situation? You could say you're wrong, right? But at the end of the day, the Hmong family has a right to their religious interpretation of a physical occurrence. And if you're the doctor and you do all of your tests and come up with a drug cocktail for the family to give their daughter, and the family decides that giving their daughter this drug cocktail is going to block her spirit from returning, not allowing her to grow or become a shaman, what do you do? True story. Again, as a doctor, you can say, you're wrong. Family's not giving the child the medicine. Do you really want to go through the legal system and have the child removed? What would it look like if you found a way to positively engage the religious worldview of that Hmong family? By the way, you guys are all looking at me like all somber and stuff. That happens 25 times a day where he works. It might not be as stark as a family saying, this seizure is preparation for shamanhood. But when a patient says, when Dr. Santillian says, you gotta stop smoking or you're gonna die, and a patient says, I'm gonna pray to God for strength, he doesn't have to believe in that, but he hears it 20 times a day. How do you, as a Western trained doctor, work within the 15 or 20 religious identity worldviews that will present themselves to you every day in everything from something as complex as, no, my daughter's being prepared to be a shaman, to I'm asking God for help to stop smoking, right? I mean, literally, you could maybe have a subfield on religious diversity issues in the healthcare system alone. So just because I'm a geek, I'm going to give you one more example on this. Am I answering your question, by the way? So the answer is, present students with case studies in these situations and say, if you're a doctor in this situation, what do you do? I'm not making this up, right? How do you engage the situation? If there is a deep disagreement between the Somali Muslim workers at a meatpacking factory, which has happened in at least a half dozen towns in America, documented, like New York Times story documented, and the other workers, huge tension, walkouts, right? And you're the football coach at the local high school, and you've got the kids of these workers on your football team, and there's been a fight on the factory floor on a Friday afternoon. What's your pep talk on Monday afternoon? Right? If the Muslim families in your school system say, my kid hasn't eaten for 2 weeks because the only pizza you serve is sausage pizza, what do? Easy. We're going to have cheese pizza. You send it out in your school newsletter. We have learned that a population of our students here is not able to partake in our school lunch because of pork products. And so we're happy to have an inclusive school environment. We will not be having pork products anymore. And a group of parents calling themselves parents organized around Sharia show up in your office. And they say it starts with no pork. It ends up with Christians being killed. There have been anti-Sharia amendments in 37 states in America. You think that school superintendents, school principals haven't dealt with anti-Muslim organized efforts by parents in schools in which there are Muslim students? A school in Virginia, a teacher had her kids recite Arabic as part of a lesson. Massive backlash by parents. Point that I'm making is, you start to put these cases in front of students and you say, what would you do if you were this teacher? What would you do if you were this principal? What would you do if you were this doctor? What would you do if you were this mayor? What would you do if you were running this meatpacking plant? Okay, now, what knowledge base and skill set would you require to do this work well? Now let's practice. And you do, frankly, the same thing that business schools and medical schools have been doing forever. You present a case, you ask the question what people's instinctive approach is, you start to build a knowledge base and a skill set, and then you try, then you practice, you mock it up, right? That is one vision for interfaith studies. It's interestingly a vision that looks more like public health than it looks like women's studies. Although I think that there's plenty of visions for this. I'm actually not personally tied to a single vision. Here's what I'm tied to. I am tied to us no longer missing the massive impact that religion and matters of religious diversity make in our society. And I think that we have missed it in diplomacy, right? 20 years before Madeleine Albright, Stansfield Turner was the director of the CIA in 1979. You know what he missed? This little thing called the Iranian Revolution. You want to know why? He says himself, we had files on Iranian film. We had files on Iranian music. We had files on Iranian economics. You know what we didn't have? Files on Iranian religion. You think now, how do you not have files on Iranian religion? It's not a part of the radar screen of even the director of the CIA. How do we stop missing these things? How do we stop missing them in our hospitals? How do we stop missing them in our schools? I think the only way we do that is if, frankly, people upstream in the academy make it a research priority, a teaching priority, and a training priority. Thank you.